Whoa. I'll be whispering from here on. All right. Yes, I'm a lead architect and lead developer and architect at Datema Retail. We build Easy Shop, a self-scanning solution, and just try to make shoppers' lives better. And as a lead developer and architect, I've taken an interest into how we build stuff, like as in how do we structure our code? How do we present the code? How is the code structured? Because as in a mentoring role and code reviews and etc., there's a lot of reading of code, and when it doesn't look as you expect it to, it's a lot of extra work. And I was looking on how can we somehow not necessarily automate the structure, but how do we automate discovering that it's not following our standards? And that's why I found the Roslyn analyzers. So what are the Roslyn analyzers? I will answer that by looking at the problem they're solving, which is, I partly described it, but still. So if we go back, sort of before 2015 for the C# compiler, I assume the VB as well, but still a lot of compilers care about language and that's it. There's nothing else. It's just if you're using the keywords correctly, if your order evaluation is right and you're using the same name for the same variables, it'll be happy. Otherwise, it'll let you know. So this is perfectly valid C# code. It is, however, not that readable. And so to solve these problems, Microsoft created FXCOP, and we'll talk about StyleCOP in a minute. So first FXCOP, it performed static analysis of your assembly. So after compilation, it would look at how you're interacting with the APIs and things like that. And it would output a report. And it helped you by identifying issues with you're not passing culture info in string comparisons. If you're declaring your types outside of namespaces, which is okay, but not recommended. And are you disposing your iDisposables? And lots of other stuff. But what FXCOP didn't do was linting. So it did not check your code structure whatsoever. And if linting means it says here it's the Wikipedia definition, a static code analysis tool used to flag programming errors, bugs, stylistic errors, and suspicious constructs. And to deal with that side, they created StyleCOP. So StyleCOP would analyze your source files and cared more about the structure of your code, readability, naming from a point of view of sort of are you following the guidelines of the .NET framework? There's official guidelines how you should name things. You don't have to follow them, but they have guidelines. And spacing, as in, are you using sort of if, white space, parenthesis, or are you just putting it all together? Maintainability would look at, do you have very large methods? Do you have sort of deep inheritance trees? Is it difficult to maintain this code over time? They both, however, suffered from, you might have heard this fall into the pit of success that Microsoft uses a bit. This was more a climb up to the pit of success, because there were separate installations. And also this is in sort of earlier days of the internet, so you didn't necessarily find everything easily. You had to dig into the SDK, CD and stuff like that to find your installation files. It was tricky to get running during automated builds. It was possible. So this is a quote off of Stack Overflow, someone who tried to install FXCOP 12, I think, and Visual Studio 2010 or something. It took 6 hours to get it working on a build server, sort of without Visual Studio, because you can always install Visual Studio. And it was using these XML files for configuration, which this leaves not very much. These rule sets, you might still come across them, but they're you're basically just turning on if it's supposed to be an error or warning or similar. The actual configuration had to happen somewhere else. And then in 2015, Microsoft went to RTM, so released the manufacturer of Roslyn compiler, and with that came the .NET compiler platform Roslyn analyzers. And these are a evolution of FXCOP and StyleCOP, and it analyzes code quality and code style. It analyzes your source code while you're coding or during build. You can configure it in editorconfig, in the project file, or command line. We'll look at that in a bit. And it should work for C# and VB. I'm C#, so I haven't actually verified it for VB, but that's what the documentation says. And since the .NET 5 SDK release, it's included. Before that, it was a NuGet package. It will work for any SDK style project. So you have this project tag SDK at the beginning of your project file, then it works. It's enabled for .NET 5 and later framework targets. So .NET 5, .NET 6 right now, and I guess 7 preview. You can enable it with this enable net analyzers true for targets previous. So I have built it. We have the .NET framework ourselves, and it works fine to analyze .NET 4.7, 4.7.2. It should, in theory, work all the way back to .NET 1, but at own risk. And if you don't have an SDK style project, you can install this NuGet package called Microsoft Code Analysis Net Analyzers. And it should work then as well. So this image again, compilers just don't care. Turns out Roslyn does care. There's a lot of structural errors here, but there's also some like they're not disposing. So we'll start looking at the code quality rules that's included. It's a very high level look. They begin with the name CA. There are, just to make things confusing, a few IL names, which is they're stuck in a single file. So if you're building single file compilation and you're doing something wrong or not suggested, you might come across IL. They're also part of the code quality rules. But everything else in code quality is CA rules. There are about 200 rules in 11 categories. 16 of these rules are enabled by default for .NET 6. And the categories are things like design. Are you designing your APIs according to the .NET standard guidelines? Globalization, it's the sort of culture info and other globalization things. Portability and interoperability, if anyone's doing COM32 p-invoke calls, it'll help you out there. Maintainability, again, this sort of is your code easy to maintain over time, large functions, complex inheritance trees. And there's more performance, there's more stuff, there's 11 categories. So we'll just look at some few examples. I'm just going to see if I remember to reset. It's building. All right, that's good. So I have disabled these. There are two CS. There's something with the compiler. It has to do with that my demo code is not actually doing anything, so it gets starts complaining about that. But I've taken them away so we can see the actual errors we're interested in. We'll start with this enabled by default. Do not use reference equals. I will zoom a bit here. So do not pass an argument with value type int to reference equals. Due to value boxing, this called reference equals will always return false. So as I understand it, when you take a value, in this case it's an integer. It's 2 ints and you put them into an object to pass into reference equals, it'll do this boxing thing and you'll get 2 instances, different instances. So reference equals will never be the same. So you're either not getting what you're expecting, like you're expecting it to actually check something that it's not going to, or you could just replace it with false. So these are the sort of things it can help you with. The other one I have here, oops. You have your computer standby. It's flickering. Sorry, I've had this. My screen has been bugging me today. I can always look over here. So, what this is about, this rule, enums should have a 0 value. Since an enum type is underlying, it's an integer, and integers are default initialized to 0. It's good practice to have a 0 value or a 0 name in the enum things. Now it's not doing anything, so we're going to have to turn on more rules. We can build, now I've enabled all rules. We'll look at configuring in a bit. So now there's 51 errors instead. And this should, there we go. Add a member to trace level that has a value of 0 with a suggested name of none. So that's good practice. If you're using enums that are flags, so flags is where the bit value of the integer, underlying integer, is a flag to turn on something or off something, then it's not necessary to have a none. But they do suggest you should call the 0 value none, so this will give you an error. Change the name of call stack to none. All right. Let's look at some code style stuff. These names begin with IDE, and there are 80 rules in 5 categories. Language, which is how you use the C# language, so are you writing this dot, the local field, or something else? And this is the guidelines. I'm not sure what they say, but you can configure all this. I think the default is to not write this dot, because no one does, or very few do, I should say. Unnecessary code, so detect code that isn't being used. Miscellaneous, it's a good category name. Formatting, so how are you structuring your code? There's some spacing involved, and there's a few other things. We'll look at that. Naming, so naming here is not naming if you're following the guidelines. Naming here is a very you can specify how types should be named. So it's a very detailed thing where you can say that static things should have all capitalization and things like this. And some examples here. Object initializer. So this is, should you initialize object using like an object initializer, or should you set it afterwards like this? And then the default is that you should use an object initializer. So you can get this, and you can get a code help for it as well too, or code fix. And you have, for instance, here unused parameter. Move this way. We're not seeing anything here. Why is that? The code style stuff, you do most of the. I'd recommend using editorconfig to configure it. So we'll add. Now everything's moving. Here we go. We'll add all of the rules here as well. And now you can see remove unused parameter, unused parameter. Param, if it's not part of a public, shipped public API. So it's a suggestion, like you're not using it, you can remove it. those are 2 examples of the style rules. Now, title is why should we care about code style? I think code quality sounds like we don't need to talk about it too much. If you enable code quality, you might get lots of warnings. So you might want to configure what code quality stuff you should have. But as a tool to help you code, it seems code quality things are good. But why should you care about code style? So this is a recipe for a sort of sponge cake, sockerkaka in Swedish. The recipe is in Swedish, so if you don't speak or read Swedish, I apologize, but you can, after you look at it for a while and you see, oh look, there's some ingredients over here, and also there's some steps. I should probably do these things, but I should probably put the batter in the pan before I put the cake in the oven, and before that I should probably put on the oven. And there's some extra tips and extra actions. And it's difficult because you're spending energy trying to figure out what things are before you even can actually start figuring out what's going to happen. And the second point is, now let's say you think, this recipe needs salt. Like, where do you put it? Like, where should you put it, on here or up there? Same thing if it's an extra step. So this way of presenting it seems much better. Like, it's easy, add salt down there. You want some sort of topping on top afterwards, that's another step. And this is about getting away from trying to figure out what the code is. Like, let's try and make the code look the same way, so when you look at it, you know what's what. And you don't have to start trying to parse, like, where are the fields stored here? Where are the functions? Like, which are the public? Which are the private? So, with that said, let's look at some configuration. First, I already turned on. Now I turn on all code quality rules. This does not turn on code style rules, code quality rules. And as a default, you can set it to, as a default, it's default. So you have like default here. You can change it to none if you would like that. Let's see what it says on the build here first. Because I still have these enabled. I will turn these off over here. They're still there. Go away. No, that's me. Sorry. Everything is working exactly as planned. 50 warnings. And if I turn off, that's what I was going to do. See, I forgot that step. None. Just so you see that it actually works. Now there are no warnings. This is it's not a very granular way of doing it, but if it's a small project, and for other reasons you can do it, so just to prove that it's actually working. If I build it for minimum, it's 18 errors. And then all again. 50 errors. So, but if you have a very large code base, this can give you thousands and thousands of warnings, like as I've found out myself. So you might want to find a more granular level, and either you can go for something you care about, so you can go into specific categories. So this is, for instance, the performance rules. Oops. Now we have 27 warnings. So this is the format. I'm going to go into that in a second. You do not want to work. There we go. 28. Right. So if we take this. This is written in a format where you have analysis level, and you first put the level. So that's the level of the .NET framework. Each .NET SDK actually gives us, outputs a certain amount of rules for a specific level. So if default will validate against these 16 rules, minimum a bit more, recommended a bit more, and all will do all code styles, code quality rules. But if you worked a lot and you want to make sure your build doesn't break, and you do an upgrade of the SDK, so like you still build against say .NET 6, but you upgrade the SDK to the 7 level, it'll be more rules included. If you have latest, it might break your build again. So this is a way of, you can set this to 6 for instance, and it should stay with the .NET 6 SDK version of the rules. And then you have then it's the amount of rules. And the same format is down here. Now it's called analysis level and category. It's the same sort of tag, but with the name of the category as well. And you can also use these to turn off, in a sense, because they're categories have higher priority than the top. So you turn off, we went from 50-ish to sort of 33 warnings. A word of caution here, you can turn on code styles analysis as well, and this is level style, say let's turn on some more stuff, be sure we're error list. All right. Well, now it's not doing what I expected it to do. Point is here that well, let's do it this way. So I'll turn this off, because then we should see something, I hope. Oh no, see this, I keep forgetting this. This tag, when you're enforcing code styles in build, you have to have this, enforce code style in build true. Not to forget. We do that, and now we have 136 warnings. These should be mostly style warnings. There might be some other ones, because the default ones should still be active. And now we get to the word of caution. So again, I build with analysis level latest all and analysis level style latest recommended. Lots of warnings. And now if I change this to all, you have 50 warnings. It took me a while to figure out that when the modes, as they're called modes, when they match on the top, as all the analysis level and the category style, this is only category style. When they match, you will only get code quality validation. But that's okay, you can turn on code styles in editorconfig, but it might be a thing you want to test, and then you realize it's not validating, and you're wondering why. If it's a bug, or if it's somebody's if statement that has gone wrong, I don't know. So we turn that off. All right, then what also can happen then, if you like treating warnings as errors, you spend lots of time making sure all your errors becomes warnings. All your warnings becomes errors. You will now, this is the thing that can also happen. Like you make sure all your warnings are done, you have no more warnings, you turn on code quality, and all of a sudden you have lots and lots of errors. You can then disable those. So that, and this is code analysis, treat warnings as errors to false. And now we still have those CS rules, you might remember, or the CS things, those are still producing errors, but none of the code quality stuff is anymore. And there are some oddities around this, like I thought this should still bring them back to error as a warning, but they just kind of mostly disappear. So be aware of that as well. But that's the way to, if you have treat warnings as errors set to true, this can help you with that. Let's quickly then look at how to do this in the... Actually, what I want to try first is change my mind. You can also do this in command line, and what that means is that you can pass these values and override them, I hope anyways, through command line. So right now we're doing what, 50 warnings. Then you do .NET build. I'm going to add no incremental, which is rebuild, because when you're dealing with this, sometimes you're not actually changing any files, and then it just will take whatever you had before and you'll get 0, 0. It looks really nice. So 50 war warnings. Okay, well, how about then you can pass these, they're called like MS build parameters. I'm not sure how that works. I assume they just wind up in MS build somewhere. Analysis level equals just none, and now you have 4 warnings again. So you can override this from command line, which of course you can do in a CI build or similar. So you can have them enabled when you're working on the code, and then when you build it, you hope that it's whatever. If you set it up as errors, for instance, that no one commits codes that has errors, and then you don't need this step, or you just don't want to break the build. If someone enables your the codes and the analyzers. This works for pretty much anything you have in the CS project as well. So yeah, we don't have any code styles. So and I also said we can run this for earlier versions of target framework. So if we build this, I'm going to rebuild because that did not build. There are no errors. And then you can use this enable net analyzers tag, but you also need to turn on the analyzers. Or we have the default set, but I don't have any errors in the default set, so I turn them all on. And now there's 9 warnings. So that's how you enable them for older .NET frameworks. Older than 5 anyways. Let's see. Now we can look a bit at the editor config. So here we already used this .NET analyzer diagnostic and then .severity. That's set to warning. And I should say the editor config works by sort of it's when it's building, it's looking at the rules in your folder, and it'll look up as well, like higher up. But the longest path is how they describe it. Is the one that wins if there's conflicting rules. So you can be more specific in subfolders or turn things on and off in subfolders. And then there's one thing is that it'll look up until it finds this root equals true, and then it'll stop. So it won't look higher and then that. But if you don't add one of these, you can, for instance, drop an editor config in the root of each repo, and it should, in theory, just work everywhere. And here you can also do. All right, so first I'm going to do, because there's one difference here with that. Let's see, now I build, so I have it enabled in the editor config, but disabled here. That's not disabled, it's just not set at all. Oh, man, I just try to get away with this. So we had about 50 warnings before, and now there are 27. So when you're using editor config, there are a bunch of rules that are by default disabled. You can see that here under, I'll open up one of these and I'll zoom in a bit. So we have your project, you have dependencies, and then under dependencies there are analyzers, and there are specific analyzers under that. And anything with this down arrow that's pointing down will not be enabled in this mode is enabled by default, false. You can still enable them, but you have to be explicit about it. So let's see, I should have an example for that as well. Not there. So looking here, we only see IDE rules that are being triggered, 40, 52, and 44. But what we can do is, I gotta just 2213. You can be specific. Then it's .NET diagnostic dot the name of the rule and then severity. And we can put that to warnings. Those are errors. We can see the difference. And also you should see it here as well. So you can define down to specific rule exactly how it should behave. You can also look, we can see here now, that one is here somewhere, 2213, scroll. Oh, go away, there. Now it's a red X instead of, and what you can also do from here, that's something you want to do, is you can actually set the specific warning level, and that will also change it in editorconfig. Right. Let's go back to the slide. All right. So adding code analyzers to existing code. This is, you need to be a little bit sort of thinking about this, because if you have, say, 5 errors or 5 warnings, sorry, people will probably look at them and like, oh, maybe I can fix this. But once you get more than, I don't know, a few hundred maybe, or 50, just it's something to ignore. You'll just look at it and be like, this is too much work. And so enabling these will, if you have an existing code base, probably give you lots and lots of warnings. So when you implement them, it's one way of doing it, for instance, is like sit down as a team, enable all the rules, go through them one at a time, and just like, do we care about this one? Because some of them you don't need to care about. If you don't need to care about culture info, perhaps you don't need to deal with the warning as well, because it's work, right? But if you find things like we're not disposing things properly, then like, yeah, we care about this rule, let's make it an error. This is really important stuff. Or there are security stuff. So like, are you using algorithms that are outdated? Maybe that should be an error. So go through it as a team and figure out what you care about. And then enable those rules explicitly. Like this rule error, this rule warning, this rule error. And then go back and turn off all the other rules. Like just turn off all rules. And then you can commit and work your way that way and do it as a team. And you can activate it, like the code quality stuff is activated in project file, as you saw. You can do it in editorconfig if you want, but that's an easy way to do it. And there's also some rules have configuration options, and you do those in editorconfig. Okay. See if I can find one of those. That is my... No, not you. This one. The enum that you should have a default 0 value also has a configuration option. It's called, and now this rule number is wrong, so ignore that. The rule is actually 008. API surface. So you can specify what should it care about. So do you want to care about external stuff only, or do you want to, because that's the default, only to externally visible enum types, so internal types it shouldn't react to initially. Before I save this, let's see if we can validate that statement. I probably need to enable something somewhere here. And we wait. There we go. So it's reacting because it's an externally visible, it's a public type. So if we change this now to private internal, come on. There we go. So now it's not triggering, but if we change it to internal, at some point, maybe. Or is this not written? Oh, see, and this is also fun. So there's something taking a file lock on editorconfig. I'm not sure what. I'm assuming it's Visual Studio. Perhaps when it's reading the rules and parsing, so that the editorconfig isn't changing while it's trying to figure out the rules. There we go. Now we're back. So they also have options, and the options, even the code quality rules, some of them have options, and you set those in the editorconfig. And code style, it's a bit different, since I recommend just using the editorconfig. And you can either then start from scratch and just try to add rules, which is like there's a list on Microsoft Docs if you want to see them, number and what they mean. Or you can look in the analyzer list there under dependencies and just sort of turn them on one by one. That's a lot of work. You can use the default netcode style editorconfig. There is one to download off of Microsoft Docs. In theory, when you create, I can show you that. You can do add new item. I'll show you, but I won't do it because it's not working for me. I'm not sure if it's me or if it's Visual Studio. If I do add new item, editorconfig, this one that says .NET should give you the default. I get an empty file. So whether that is Visual Studio or me, I haven't figured out yet. Editorconfig file default gives you pretty much just an empty file. It will say is top or whatever that one is called, and then that it's for C# and VB files, and that's it. And then you can start from there if you want. Another way of doing it is to open an editorconfig file, and you get this long list of stuff. Like, how do you want to do? Do you want to use tabs or tab sizes, like tabs or spaces? It's a popular debate. Which tab size? Do you want indent box? Like all of this. It's okay. You can also deal with code style, and so white space and code style is it's sort of like code style is everything that isn't formatting-ish. And naming style, it's more complex. If we have time, we'll do something about that. And then the rest of the analyzers, all of the CA stuff. When it comes to, and just so you can see here also, there's a star. So usually when you open an editorconfig and it's empty, it will give you a star. And then when you click save, it'll just save all of this basically. So now the editorconfig is full of stuff. But if you go instead to tools, if you start here, tools, options, and you find it under text editor, C#, code style, general. You have quite a nice UI. I wish they would put this in when you're editing the editor config, because here you can say like, I do prefer this for field access. Oops, that was not so good. And it'll show here, like, this is what it'll look like, or this is what you should write. And if you disable this, now it's like, we don't need this, okay? So you can go through here and it'll help you, it'll give you a good guide. What does this actually do? And then you can, once you've decided, you've made up your mind about all the rules, you can export the rules as an editor config. So that, again, sit down as a team. What do we care about? And this is difficult because people have different code styles, but maybe at least you can find some things that you agree on. All right. I want more analyzers. So there are more analyzers to use out there. So if you want more advanced styling options, you have the StyleCop lives on, in a sense. It's now the StyleCop analyzer, so they've sort of migrated, I think, a bunch of stuff that didn't make it into the .NET, the Roslyn analyzers. And you can do things like, we don't want new lines, more than one. Like, one new line is fine, but not two. Sort of warn about things like that. It's much more granular. Like, are comments allowed to be just hanging free, or do you need them to be attached to a piece of code? So it's much more advanced in that sense. If Roslinator, I haven't looked at it much myself, but there are 500 more rules around how you use C#. And these frameworks like XUnit, NUnit Mock, and others have built their own analyzers. So you can use those as well to help you write better unit tests. And you can write your own analyzer. I'm not going to look at that, but it's quite possible. And for simple things, whatever that would mean, you don't need to learn too much stuff, but otherwise you are looking at the compiled tree of symbols. It's not super easy unless you know how to work with a visitor pattern and things like that. Did I have anything else? Since I have a tiny bit more time, there are also one thing that I didn't mention. You can also, this is sort of Microsoft specific, use a global, they call it analyzer config. I'm not sure why they use names that then don't match with the file name. It would be a lot easier to just call it global config instead, but they call it analyzer config. And you can actually use any name, but unless you use .global config, you need to specify in the SDK file, or in the project file, what this file is. It works differently. You don't specify a file type, so you don't say that this is for C# or VB or anything like that. It also doesn't work for styles, but you can do specific rules. And it also works across the project instead of the editor config, which works in a sort of folder by folders structure, folder and subfolder. So if I go here and I do, let's first build. It's always good to build. Let's disable some stuff. This stuff. And let's disable even more stuff. There we go. Now we're back to the two warnings. If I go here and I do add new item, well, I can tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to add this file from the .NET Core project, but I will add it as a link. So add existing item. That's already set here. Add. You can do this. No, I locked the computer again. Try this one more time. Zoom is what I'm after. Here, add as link. Which, if you don't know what it does, it points out the file, like, so it links in the file, but it leaves it in its own location. So it shows up here, and you have slightly different icon with this arrow. And if we build now, we still only have 3 warnings now. How about that? Yeah, so these are the default rules, I hope. Global config. Oh yeah, I did that one here. There is no IntelliSense or anything for this, so you can't do shortcuts to remove comments and stuff. But anyways, it has the same format, .NET diagnostic, rule name, severity equals error. You can also use these categories and things like that, and you can use options. And now we build, and this produces an error instead. So global config works by looking at files in this project instead. You can use it if you want to. I'm sure it's good for something. I love it. I want more info. I set up a repo with these code examples if you want. There's also README, and at the bottom you have some links. Microsoft Docs, lots and lots and lots of information about Microsoft Docs, but it's almost too much. Like it's so detailed, it's difficult to get a good overview. And 2 years ago there was a guy presenting, Philip W. He doesn't even give his last name because he's afraid he will mispronounce his own last name. Editor config rule set analyzers get your code under control. It's very specific about rule sets and things like that, and it's also a few years old, so it deals with, it's from a .NET Core 3.1 or something perspective. But it's a good source if you think this seems interesting to actually look at that talk. He also does a quick example on how to write your own analyzer. And with that, thank you for listening.